Hello everyone, this is IM Josh Friedel for ChexCareer.com, and today I'll be going over the game Topalov Kramnik, the fourth game in the World Championship match that went on today. And for those of you who haven't been following, I'll give you a quick update. Kramnik is leading the match 2.5 going into this game. He won the first two, and the third was drawn. Obviously, the other masters lectured on those if you want to see them, but basically, in the first two games, Topalov was the one pressuring, but Kramnik ended up winning. The first one, Topalov simply pushed too hard in a slightly better ending and ended up getting severely punished. And then the third one, Topalov had a decisive attack, but he actually missed a force mate. And then it was tough, but he was still winning, but then he made some more mistakes and eventually ended up losing it. And the third game was somewhat more peaceful game, although still fairly exciting. I mean, with Topalov playing, it's very rarely boring. And that one ended up a draw as well. Or rather, a draw for the first time. So, Topalov is obviously fighting back. He gets white now. He just came off a draw, so he's sort of stabilized. So this would be a good game for him, obviously, to come back with a nice win. So, and from Kramnik's perspective, a draw would be totally great, or a win, obviously, would be even better, but with black, a little hard. And, so those are the standings. Kramnik's totally happy with the draw. Topalov really, he doesn't quite need a win yet, but he certainly would like one. So, D4. Topalov has played D4 in game 2 also, in his only other white game. It seems that he thinks that's the best choice against Kramnik, and if you remember the Leko-Kramnik match, Leko found that D4 was best against Kramnik also. Apparently with the Berlin/Petrov, Kramnik is just too solid, so he plays D4. D5. Again, same thing that Kramnik chose in game 2. C4. C6. So Slav or semi-Slav type structure. Knight C3. Topalov, Knight F3 is more popular more recently, but Topalov plays the slightly sharper Knight C3. The idea maybe with this is that now it does allow the winner gambit with E5, which is, not considered great, but it's certainly playable. I played it myself. And if E6, you can now play the Marshall gambit with E4, which is a very, very sharp line. So Knight C3 is a sharper line than Knight F3, but not quite as popular these days. Still, Topalov likes it sharp. So Kramnik plays Knight F6, E3, and which means that Topalov is going for a Moran. Knight F3 is a slightly sharper move, which he played in game 2, and it ended up going into a Slav. And my guess would be that against Kramnik, he simply thought Slav was too solid. So he played E3, going into Moran, so E6. Bishop F5 is a slightly more solid move. So it was a little bit of a surprise maybe when Kramnik goes for semi-Slav. However, Kramnik plays a semi-Slav setup against the Moran. He has vast experience with this, so it probably wasn't too much of a surprise. So Topalov played Knight F3, Knight BD7, Bishop D3. Queen C2 is also a fairly popular line, after which there's the fairly famous pawn sack, Bishop D6, G4. However, black usually doesn't take the pawn. Bishop B4, Knight G4 is a move, but it's rare. Bishop B4, and actually D takes C4 is becoming popular now. And this is quite crazy. It's actually called the Shabalov variation because he played it a lot for both sides. But Topalov chooses Bishop D3, which is, again, one of the main lines, tons of theory on it. Kramnik takes, DC, Bishop C4, B5, Bishop D3, Bishop D7. Very, very solid to semi-Slav, and it's quite popular these days. So now, White's main moves are castles and E4. However, Topalov plays A3. His obvious idea is he wants to sort of eschew from theory, because apparently, my guess would be at least, that he really wasn't prepared for this line. He was expecting something else. Maybe he was expecting Kramnik to be a little more cautious, instead of playing into this really sharp stuff. And my guess would be he simply wasn't very well prepared for either one of the main lines. Or else he thought Kramnik was better prepared, or maybe he just wanted to surprise him early. But A3 is a fairly rare move. So Kramnik plays b4. Fairly logical, getting his bishop out. If he takes the pawn, that is. So Topalov moves, knight e4. So this is a very common idea in this opening. For black to either play b4 and c5 or a6 and c5. Here, if a6, though, b4 could be a potential problem, locking him up, which is why he played b4. So now knight e4. Obviously, ab bishop b4 does not interest white. He doesn't want to develop black. So knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, ba. So now white simply recaptures. I think black just develops with bishop d6 and castles, and I don't know, it's certainly, eventually he's going to get in the move c5, and then it's simply going to have not too many problems. So Topalov castles to put some more pressure on him. So now if ab bishop b2, which is certainly possible, Kramnik wanted to avoid this because it basically gives white quite a bit of play. I mean, with ideas like queen b3 coming in, or even just queen c2, rook fc1, or the bishop on b7 looks sketchy. So really, that would give white exactly what he wants in this game, lots of play. So instead, black simply ignores bishop d6. So he gives white the opportunity to take back the pawn, he'll castle, he'll be perfectly happy. So b3. The idea of this move is, now when he takes back the pawn, he'll get some pressure on the a7 pawn. Whereas if ba, that file's blocked off, so it's not going to happen. Also, he may maneuver his knight around to c4, which he sort of tries to do. So knight f6. So now if the bishop moves, I think black pretty much plays c5 quite happily. And typically in this opening, if black can get in c5 in time, safely, then black's equalized. Whereas if black has to leave his pawn on c6 with the bishop on b7, it's a little bit unpleasant, and usually white's better. So c5 would be the idea. So that black kicks the bishop away would be very logical. Now, Topalov does not want to allow black to get in c5, so he plays knight d2. Sort of a strange-looking move, simply giving up the bishop. But it's well worth it, because if he could somehow get to ending, like, let's say, for example, black took here. Knight takes e4, which did not happen. Knight takes e4, bishop e7, bishop takes a3. This is going to be really nice for white, because black simply cannot play c5 without losing a pawn. And once the bishops get traded, and white gets a knight on c5 against the bishop on b7, black's going to be positionally lost here. So instead, black played queen c7, targeting h2. So now, once again, c5 could be a potential problem in some lines. So now, for example, if g3, I think what Topalov didn't like about this was that now black can capture e4 and play c5. And if you look at this bishop along this diagonal, it's quite dangerous. Now, he might not have done this immediately, but certainly in the near future, and this could be very, very risky for white. And Topalov, although he really wants to win, he doesn't want to lose. And h3 would simply be very slow, and would allow black to simply castle and get out of trouble. Any potential trouble he could get in. So he plays bishop f3, immediately moving back. So now, if black castles, white can play g3 fairly happily, or maybe even knight c4. And it's going to be very comfortable for white. So Kramnik decides that the best course of action is actually to be greedy right here. He wants to get a pawn for this. And he'll still have an opportunity to castle, so it certainly makes sense to do so. King h1, bishop d6. So he loses one tempo, because the king had to move to h1, which wasn't particularly useful, to grab a pawn. And typically a pawn is certainly worth one tempo. And here, his king is still going to have an opportunity to castle. And although white will certainly get some compensation, mainly due to the weak dark square, c5, e5, and even a5 in some lines. So white's going to have weak dark squares to work with, but will it be worth a pawn is the real question. So white attacks the bishop. Black cannot give up that bishop. Black gives up that bishop, and c5, e5, a5 squares will totally belong to white, which he really doesn't want. So bishop e7, bishop takes a3, grabbing back the pawn, castles. he doesn't want to take a3, bringing white's rook into the game and allowing queen a1. So here Topalov captures and plays, after queen takes e7, rook a5. So again, you see, Topalov is targeting the dark squares. So if Topalov can establish a blockade on those squares, and eventually win the c6 pawn, maybe a7, it's certainly going to be a very comfy game, despite the absence of the h2 pawn. So Kramnik plays rook d8. So now, it's a little harder to play a move like rook c5 when the d pawn's pinned, and queen takes c5 is sometimes possible. Also, it's just a generally good square for a rook, because now moves like c5 are possible. So king g1. The king on h1 could often be exposed to some checks, like, for example, when the knight moves, then all of a sudden queen h4 could be a problem. And basically, the king on g1 is a bit safer, so he takes this move to play that. c5. Kramnik finds a very, very nice pawn sack. So he sacrifices back a pawn. So he's not going to get material after this. However, all of a sudden, he won't have that really crappy bishop on b7. So basically what Black's doing is he's getting rid of one of the key problems with his opening. In the semi-swap, one of the biggest challenges for Black is getting the bishop on b7 into play. And here, he's doing it by sacrificing a pawn. However, if you remember, just a few moves ago, Black won a pawn. And one of the nice things about grabbing pawns is it later allows you to sacrifice one back for some positional point. And here what he's doing is he trades off his bad bishop for White's bishop, which is much better. So with this move, he frees his pieces, and it certainly helps save Black's position. If Black hadn't played this, I think he would have ended up in serious trouble after White just started developing, attacking a5, attacking c6. It would have been a big problem. So rook takes c5, knight e4. So now Black blocks White's bishop in. So if the rook simply moves, I think, depending on where, of course, but I think Black would simply play bishop d5 with a very nice game. Also, knight c3 moves are very annoying. Because, let's say, if rook e5 now, knight c3, next move Black takes on f3, and White's king is going to find itself a little bit uncomfortable. So White instead played bishop takes knight. However, letting Black have this bishop now is not so great, because this bishop, although before was really crappy behind the c6 pawn, now could be very annoying on a square like d5. Pressuring g2, pressuring b3, it's going to be pretty nice. So bishop takes d4, queen g4. Topalov brings his queen to the king side. Nothing shocking about that. It looks like a very risky proposition, however, as he may let loose his b3 pawn. So he's going to have to be very cautious. Bishop d3. This move, when I first saw it, sort of surprised me. I figured he'd go back to maybe d5. But Kramnik, what he wants to do now is, he decided his bishop may not be as good as the knight once the knight gets to e5, so he's going to trade it off. So rook a1, rook c8. The rook on c5 is very, very strong, so naturally Kramnik wants to trade it off. Rook a5. So Topalov says, oh no, you're not trading off my rook, I'm just going to put another one there. Very logical. Kramnik plays rook b8. So, a little bit of a strange shuffle there. It looks like Kramnik played an inaccuracy with rook a8 because he had to move back. However, now he has some pressure on the b3 pawn, which White let loose by playing queen g4. So he plays back. So now he forces Black to make a decision with the bishop. If he moves back, the knight can move to e5, targeting c6, which could be very nasty. So he plays bishop e4. He didn't want to take the knight immediately. If he took the knight immediately with bishop takes c4, he could simply play b takes e4. And now, not only is his weakness on d3 gone, but he's going to play something like g3 to let his king have some breathing room, and maybe queen a4, and the a6 pawn is going to be targeted. Or he'll play queen f3 and simply try to push his center pawn. So this would be very dangerous for Black. So Kramnik didn't want this, so he played bishop e4. So now knight e5 doesn't really threaten anything, because he'd be happy to trade the bishop for the knight if White's still left with the b3 pawn. So queen a1, targeting a7. It looks here as if White has some pressure. However, Black's position is still very strategically sound. The dark squares are slightly weak, but not too serious. The a7 pawn is a weakness, but can be defended. And white's king is still not perfect, so black should have some pretty adequate counterplay for this. However, it looks at the moment like white's developing an initiative. So rook b7. Now, rook takes b3 was a move that certainly had to be calculated. However, after rook takes b3, it looks like rook takes a7 at first, but after rook b1 check, queen takes b1, this would end up very good for white. Because after queen takes a7, queen takes e4, white's up the piece. So that would end up well. However, if black simply moves his queen now, say to f6, threatening perhaps queen g6, it could be a slight problem. However, the real reason this wasn't done was because of knight d2, and now the rook and bishop are forked. So, very simple. I mean, rook takes a7 looks very tempting, very tactical, but knight d2 simply wins, I think. So, that pawn's poisoned, so he plays rook b7, defending his pawn, maybe preparing to double. Knight d2. So, white decides to defend the pawn, attack the bishop. So now, again, there's the question of where that bishop's going. He plays it back to g6. Now, if bishop d5, there's a potential, although he's threatening b3 right now, that after queen a3, for example, or queen c3 would probably be more accurate, defending his knight, that now e4 is going to be very nasty. And if f5, then maybe knight c4, maneuvering to e5 could be very annoying. So, in this position, black has some dangers that he wants to get rid of. And the bishop looks very nice on d5, but also a little bit loose. So he decides not to put it there right away. So he plays his bishop back to g6. Queen goes to c3. Nice looking square for the queen. Centralized on the same files as rook, so he prepares to penetrate. Just a generally good square. So black plays h6, giving himself looks, so he doesn't have to worry about back rank threats. Rook a6. So he plans rook c6, rook c7, trying to grab the c file, even penetrate on the c file, and hopefully win a7. f7 is also potentially a target after knight f3, knight e5. So king h7, getting his king off the back rank. Knight c4, preparing to go to e5. Bishop e4. So now that the bishop's done its job on g6, it heads back to d5, where it can do more, because the f7 pawn's perfectly well defended. And now, with the knight moved from d2, it's harder to trap the bishop with g4. So f3, bishop d5. So now he's threatening putting a little pressure on b3 indirectly through the knight on c4. And so if e4, he's planning to simply take the knight. So the knight goes back to d2. Topalov likes his knight better than the bishop, so he does not want to trade the two. So now e4 is threatened, trying to trap the bishop, thus prompting Kramnik to play rook b8. So now he's threatening bishop takes b3. So he creates a square for the bishop indirectly by basically attacking the b3 pawn. So Topalov gives a check with queen d3. Kramnik plays f5. Now this move may look risky at first, and you might go, wait, Kramnik's the one up games. Why is he playing risky moves? Well, in this position, he wants to keep e4 under control. So this move really makes a lot of sense, in conjunction with the bishop on d5 and pawn on e6. Now, however, if the bishop and knight were to be traded, the e6, f5 pawns could potentially be quite weak. But with the bishop and knight on the board, it certainly makes a lot of sense to keep the knight at bay, to keep it out of e4, and to keep the e4 pawn move under control. Because now it's e4 fe in a lot of lines. It's going to be very uncomfortable. So Topalov plays rook c3, covering his b3 pawn. Queen h4. Kramnik sort of goes on the offensive a little bit. It's not a bluff quite, but he really can't create any threats with only a queen. However, he often threatens queen e1 to h4, a perpetual, which at this point, not only in position, but in the match, he certainly wouldn't mind. or force the knight to go back to a passive square. So this is just a nice active move. Also, it discourages e4, if you look, because if white had played e4 now, pawn takes, or actually not even pawn takes first, queen e1 check. So now if the king goes to h2, queen h4 check, simply a draw. If knight f1, f takes e4, f takes e4, I'll play it out, knight f1, f takes e4, f takes e4, bishop takes e4 simply would win a pawn. And if queen f1, black would take on d2, ed, queen takes d4 check, which would win a rook. So this would obviously be very not so great for white, because he certainly doesn't want to draw. So instead he plays his rook back to a1 to cover the e1 flag. So Kramnik penetrates with his queen further, again preventing e4 from really being a threat. Now if e4, fe, if fe, then queen takes d3, rook takes d3, and bishop takes b3, once again winning a pawn. Now white can win the pawn back with knight takes b3, rook takes b3, rook takes b3, rook takes b3, rook takes a7, but this would most likely be pretty much a dead draw after either rook d3 or rook b4. And this ending is pretty much dead drawn. It's a rook ending, which are notoriously drawish, not to mention there aren't many pieces left. Knight takes e4 would be possible, but then the bishop on d5 is simply way too strong. And although he's threatening a discovery, black could either sidestep with king h8 or play queen g6. Either one would leave white really without any hope of advantage here. So, not doing that, he played queen c2. So now the idea, again, is to play e4. The idea in this position is if white can get an e4, obviously he traps the bishop, but it's a major accomplishment. So now e4 is possible because there's no queen trade tactics. So Kramnik plays rook f7, again preventing e4 indirectly. That's what this whole position's about, basically. If white can get an e4, force the bishop off of d5, white's going to have a great position. Even if he doesn't win the bishop, it's a major achievement. So here, again, it really doesn't work so well. If e4, f takes e4. Again, if knight takes, white hasn't accomplished anything, because the bishop on d5 is so strong then. And if f takes, there's queen f2 check, followed by something like, let's say if king h2, for example. Again, there are lots of moves here, but basically, there'd be too much pressure. The white king is basically way too open. Between ideas like rook f4, even bishop moving away, the d4 pawn's hanging, not to mention black can just try to keep checking white with something like queen f4, it's simply too much. White doesn't want to do this. Obviously white wants to win, but doing this would most likely allow him to lose, which he certainly doesn't want. Topalov really cannot afford another loss against a solid player like Kramnik in this match. Also, e4 would just be too loosening, so he wouldn't want to play that in general anyway. So rook f1, covering that. Queen goes back to g6. So again, indirectly preventing e4, because now, although this is more direct, fe, rook f1. King f1 is not really what white wants. The king is just getting way too exposed here. And after king f1, the king is just way too open. And this is really not what white wants to do. And also, I mean, even if the bishop had to move here, the king would simply be too open. So really, e4 is just not getting played here anytime soon. So white plays queen d3. Again, sort of a maneuvering game going on here, trying to get e4. Because now, if he can take with the queen, although e4 is not covered enough, maybe he could play it in the future. So maybe now after queen d3, he's planning rook fc1, something like that. And so basically, it's a maneuvering game. White's trying to get an e4, black's trying to stop it. Queen g3. So Kramnik again plays his queen in. This is where, notice how, with the queen here, black wanted the queen here to prevent e4. With the queen on d3, he puts the queen here so that he can have indirect pressure on the queen this way. If the queens get traded, the draw is almost certainly going to be the result. So Kramnik's trying to trade them, Topalov's trying to keep them up, keep the pressure up. So rook fc1, rook goes back to b7, pressuring b3. So now, again, at b4, everything is traded, draw, pretty much. Queen c2, queen g5. So now the rook can't penetrate because e3 would hang. So rook a1. Again, putting pressure on a7, maybe planning to bring the rook up now that the queen's not there to penetrate. Kramnik plays now queen f6. So now f4 ideas are maybe in the works. After king h8, f4, and then d4 is going to be a little bit weak. So now he's preventing e4 by a different method. Instead of preventing e4 either by attacking the square or with a tactic, he's preventing it by attacking d4. A very common tactic, by the way. If white has pawns on d4 and e3, for example, and if black wants to prevent white from getting the duo with d4, e4, he'll often either attack the e4 square or attack the d4 pawn, so the white pawn on e3 will have to stay there. So queen d3, again, a lot of maneuvering going on. Again, everyone knows the plans. Topalov's trying to play e4, Kramnik's trying to stop him. Now with queen d3 here, this is very clever because the black queen can't be on g3 now where it wants to be after this move. So it looks as if Topalov's temporarily outmaneuvered Kramnik. However, Kramnik is not one to be outmaneuvered. Rook d7. Now with d4, he'll simply move the bishop back and d4 will be under lots of pressure. So rook a4, protecting d4 again. Rook bd8, again. Pressure on d4, aiming against d4. So d4 now, of course, he's not going to take it. He's going to move his bishop back to attack d4 because if he took it, now there's possibilities for discovery, which he doesn't want, along this diagonal, after either piece captures, really. So although they may not be fatal, it would certainly be an annoyance. However, if the bishop simply moves back, it's not really easy to defend d4 here, as you can see. So, and also there's the nasty tactic is e5, black can simply take it with queen takes e5. de, rook d3, and this is good for black. So, again, very, very tricky tactics and positional play going on at once. So, black's trying to prevent e4, white's trying to play it, and they're both doing it by tactical means, if you notice, which is often how positional play is. You prevent or try to accomplish a positional goal, but through tactical means. Very, very common. So, Topalov plays rook c5. Again, maybe planning rook c to a5, pressuring a7, as well as maybe hoping that after the bishop moves, he can plan a rook on e5. So king g8. Notice how the black king's been under the line of fire for a while, but hasn't had an opportunity to move because white's always been threatening e4. Here, though, e4 really isn't a threat. So he takes the time to move his king back to a better square. Knight c4. So Topalov is planning to hop to e5. This Kramnik really can't allow, so he plays bishop takes c4. Rook a takes c4. So it looks like white's accomplished something. He's traded off the knight for the bishop, and the bishop on d5 was pretty nasty. So now it looks like as if he should be able to target the e6 pawn with rook e5. Well, obviously not now because of the tactic queen takes e5, but in the future. As well as maybe penetrate on the c file, attack the a7 pawn. So it looks as if Topalov's really made some progress here. He's outmaneuvered Kramnik, which by no means is easy, into a position which probably favors white a bit. So Kramnik plays f4. He has to act quickly. If he allowed white to play f4, rook e5, he'd be under lots of pressure. So he has to play f4. Rook c6, putting pressure on e6. fe, queen e3. So the danger now is that everything is going to liquidate. So although it looked like white had made progress, it looked like after rook a takes c5, Topalov had gotten an advantage because of the weak pawns and everything. However, Kramnik had anticipated this with f4. So now, although both kings are a little loose, it looks as if things may just trade off into a draw. So rook takes d4, rook takes e6, little in between move. So now, this looks very risky. For example, now, rook d1 check. King h2, however, there are really no checks left. And even queen e3, king f2 might be impossible, because even after this, which looks horrid for white, king g3, there are really no good checks left. So even here, white would probably be fine, and have to trade with queen g5, otherwise black gets mated. So in these positions, usually it's whoever has the initiative wins, and if neither side can really attack the king, it'll often end up a draw. So queen h4. So now rook d1's a mate threat, pretty much, or winning the queen. Rook takes d4, practically forced. If rook e8 check, then rook takes e8, queen takes e8. Queen takes e8, king h7. White has no checks. And although a draw is again the likely result, white's certainly not on the better side of it. So, rook takes d4, queen takes d4, rook e8 check, a little tactic. Obviously, rook takes d8, queen takes d4 would win for white. But after king h7, the queens get traded, and a draw is agreed upon. Because in these positions, in rook endings with even pawns, not many pawns left, especially with A and B, the A and B pawns, which are very drawish. If they're both A pawns, one side might have a slight edge. But because they're A and B, it's pretty much impossible. So a draw was agreed upon. So again, although it looked like a fairly positional game, especially compared to the crazy round 2 game, where Topalov lost but attacked, it was nonetheless interesting. Topalov played a slightly offbeat system, tried to throw off Kramnik. It looked like Kramnik played a successful pawn sacrifice in return. And although Topalov was always trying to pressure Kramnik by trying to get in the e4 break, he never was able to accomplish it. And once the majors got traded and Kramnik played f4, it looked like things were just liquidating, and there was really nothing Topalov could do about it. So therefore the game was drawn, and Kramnik would certainly be happy with this result, a draw with black up 2 games. Topalov is probably starting to enter desperation mode, knowing he has to get 2 wins off an ultra-solid Kramnik. So it'll be interesting to see how both players react to this. Anyhow, this is Josh Friedel signing off for chesslecture.com.